Greg Downs. I'm here with a fellow co-editor of the Journal of the Civil War Era, Kate Mazer, to host this, the 13th, the lucky 13th of these webinars that originated last summer in an effort to originally to make up for a panel that we were not able to do on how to submit to literary magazines to academic journals, remembering my other life, to academic journals during last summer. And that grew to a really exciting series of talks, many with recently published authors like the one that we have today. So we've greatly enjoyed the many questions that have come in, both ahead of time and during. When you want to submit a question, utilize the Q&A function, and we'll be pulling from those throughout. As we reach another transition in our surrounding environment, we are considering what to do next with these, whether there will remain a demand for them in the what hopefully edges toward a post-pandemic time, whether they'll remain a demand but in a different format, something more like a podcast rather than video. We're going to be contemplating this, talking about this with our editorial board and other editors. And if any of you have strong ideas and opinions, just shoot us an email. Kate and I would be delighted to hear any of your ideas about where we might go with this and what iteration it might take. I should say, because sometimes at the end of the hour we are rushed to finish on time. Should say at the beginning that none of this would be possible without the amazing work and expertise and kind of astounding competence, almost disgusting levels of confidence and humbling levels of confidence by Matt Isham and Cicely Zander, who have made all of this possible. And without whom all of at least my and possibly Kate's limitations would be exposed in full. So we greatly appreciate them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to introduce today's guest.
All right, well, hi everyone, and thanks so much for being here. Just wanted to add one small thing, which is all of the webinars that we've done are available on the Journal's YouTube page, so it's easy to find. It's connected to the Journal's website, and I think, yes, Cecily just put a link to it. So all of the past ones that we've done are there, and this one will be there too, and that's a way we've used to kind of preserve these and allow people to see them whenever they want. So that is that's there for you, regardless of what we end up doing going forward. So it's really a pleasure today to introduce Kevin Waite, who is here with us. And Kevin is an assistant professor of history at Durham University in the United Kingdom. He is the author of this brand new book with sparkling cover colors, West of Slavery, The Southern Dream of a Transcontinental Empire, just published by University of North Carolina Press. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Kevin's next book is A History of the Life and Times of Biddy Mason, a Georgia slave turned California real estate entrepreneur. And she makes a cameo in this book, so we can see the beginning, the germ maybe of an idea for next project. His future ongoing and current work is funded by a collaborative research grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which he co-directs with Sarah Berenger Gordon of Penn. And his writing has also appeared in the Journal of the Civil War Era, the Cambridge History of the American Civil War, the Atlantic, National Geographic, the LA Times, Slate, and the New Republic, and the Washington Post, among others. So it's great to have Kevin here with us today. Thanks so much for being here. Apologies if you hear background noise right now. So Kevin, let's start off with our kind of usual starting question. Just give us, for the people here who haven't read your book yet, give us a sense of, what is this book about? What's your nutshell description of the book and why it matters?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Kate. Before I jump right into that, I just want to say a huge thank you to you and Greg for inviting me to talk about my book with you, and to Matt and Cecily for making it all happen. And then to everybody on this call, weathering 15 months of Zoom fatigue to come out and listen in. So the book is really about the expansion of slaveholding power across the American West in the mid-19th century. And that's achieved partly through the expansion of slavery itself, White Southerners brought somewhere between 500 and 1,500 enslaved African Americans to California during the gold rush there. And they brought probably around 100 more to Utah and then another 100 more to New Mexico during the same period. They also successfully defended forms of Native American servitude against a Republican attempt to outlaw indigenous bondage in the Southwest. But really, more important than the presence of slavery itself in the West, I argue, were really all the subtle ways that Southerners extended their political power across the region. And they did this through really shrewd and you might say devious politicking, through a virtual monopoly on federal patronage, and through some really big transcontinental infrastructure projects. And the upshot of all of this, I argue, is that slaveholders and their allies basically transformed the far Southwest. And by the far Southwest, I really mean California, New Mexico, what would become Arizona, and to a certain extent, Utah, into a political client of the slave South. And that in turn, I think, had really profound repercussions on the sectional debates of the 1850s, on the shape of the secession movement, on Confederate grand strategy during the war itself, and also on the politics of Reconstruction in the far West.
Terrific. We're going to come back. Those are really big arguments that you make. We really enjoyed wrestling with them as we read, and we'll come back to some of those. But I wonder if it might also make sense to pull back and to ask sort of how you use what's in and out in the way that you're using the West here, so that people can see where the argument sits. Because as you well know, as a West Coaster, if I'm right, people who grew up on the East can, rapidly believe that even if the West doesn't begin at the Hudson River, it certainly begins, at the Appalachian Mountains or something like that. And so what are the places that you focused on? And also, let's start with that. What are the places that you focus on for your argument about the nature of the West?
Sure. So for me, the far Southwest during this period really starts west of Texas. And I'll use the book cover to illustrate. So I'm really looking at this, call it the Southwest corner of the United States in the 1850s and 60s, and to a certain extent in the 1870s. New Mexico territory, Utah territory. Within New Mexico territory, you have what would become Arizona territory, and then the state of California. And I could have pushed the study up into Oregon, because in a lot of ways, Oregon fits into the pro-slavery mold. Delegates from Oregon at the 1860 Democratic Presidential Convention basically aligned themselves with the slave states of the South and with California. But Oregon didn't quite fit the set of arguments I was making for this book, because it's really about how slaveholding Southerners envisioned the far Southwest, or how they envisioned their power operating across the country. And I found relatively few instances of them talking seriously about the inroads that they could make in Oregon, partly because it was not on any direct overland trails from the slave states, whereas Southern California was, whereas Arizona was, New Mexico was, parts of Utah were. So when they thought of where in the West they might have a reasonable purchase, it was what I define here as the Southwest that really caught their attention.
That's great. Thanks for that. And so I wanted to follow up and have you talk a little bit more about your focus on infrastructure and patronage, topics that I personally love in history, but people don't always gravitate to. I mean, they sound so exciting on the surface. It's always infrastructure week in your book, right? So I guess the question is, just tell us a little bit more about how you write about patronage politics, who's getting patronage and why does it matter? And where does infrastructure fit in, and what types of infrastructure are you talking about? And then kind of wrapping that all together, how does that fit into your overall argument about how slaveholding interests developed the Southwest?
Yeah, that's super important, Kate. So you're right, infrastructure and patronage aren't exactly the sexiest historical topics. And I think that's one of the reasons that historians haven't paid that much attention to this region, at least in a pro-slavery frame during this period. And a lot of the projects, the pro-slavery projects in the Southwest that I'm writing about didn't really come to pass. So what occupies maybe 10% of the book is the Southern campaign to construct a transcontinental railroad that would end in Southern California. They came close on a number of occasions, but as we all know, no transcontinental railroad was built until after the Civil War. So this is what I call in the book a monumental non-event, which is sort of riffing off of a concept from Bob May, who I actually see in the attendees. But even though they didn't build this transcontinental railroad, they came close on a number of occasions, and they got the next best thing, which was the first major overland mail road constructed during this period, a phenomenally large and expensive project that really helped sort of stitch the Southwest and the slave South together. Patronage was also another key component of this campaign to influence the region politically. And it really helped that Democratic presidents occupied the presidential mansion for the majority of this period, through the majority of the 1850s. And so they were making the final call on the patronage appointments in the region and across the country. The San Francisco Customs House became so sort of overstuffed with Southern-born federal appointees that they called it the Virginia Poorhouse. This is where you would go to get a nice federal sinecure and do not much, but exercise disproportionate political power. So in this way, Southerners were really able to place their friends in really important federal positions across California and across the territorial Southwest, and exercise power, vastly disproportionate to their numbers.
Great. And just, one thing I want to connect this to is, so you have, generally a string of Democratic presidents, the ability of the Democrats to distribute patronage in the executive branches. What difference did it make, apart from California, that a lot of these places were federal territories? Just kind of expand on that a little bit. Kind of why did it matter that we were talking, New Mexico territory and other places that are not actually states?
In short, it made a huge difference. The book is to a certain extent a case study in minority rule, and that's made possible because of the appointment process for the federal territories. So the governor, the secretary, the territorial Supreme Court is all decided by a president, and in this period, it's decided by a Democratic president. So this is one of the reasons why New Mexico was able to pass a slave code, a really draconian slave code modeled closely on the slave codes of the far South, is because they had Southerners running the show, that were appointed by Buchanan. So it was a Mississippian in 1859 in New Mexico who really jammed that slave code through the legislative process.
I wonder if it would, if we could get you to respond to one of the myths that you set up early on that you're writing to deconstruct, a kind of myth that associates the West with the North, which we can think as sort of summed up like in Susan Schulten's amazing study of maps, right? And the ways that the sort of free, or sometimes even more starkly portrayed, God's blessing versus God's curse maps, the moral maps of the 1850s, where the West is sometimes pictured as in danger, but often grouped in with a free North. Or the 1864 presidential election map, where you look out at a seemingly solid Republican West. So that even readers who might have a sense that, well, the South hoped, but it didn't really have much chance of fruition, based on those kind of images. And that this assumption, this affiliation, this sort of natural affinity between West and North is something you're looking to pull apart. So tell us the grounds of that. What's wrong with those maps, and what's wrong with that myth?
The image that kept popping into my mind as I was writing this book was from I don't know if it was my middle school textbook or my high school textbook. I think we've all seen it. It's a map of the slave states and the free states, and the slave states are usually coded red and the free states are blue. And of course, California is blue with them. And then the Southwest gets this sort of like neutral, the federal territories get this neutral beige color. So it gives the impression that first, the struggle over slavery was really confined to the eastern half of the country. And second, the federal territories were somehow, remained aloof from all these debates, and that California was in league with the Free North in these debates, and that just doesn't hold up. Again, I swear this is probably going to be the last time I hold up the book, but I think politically, the map of the United States really looks more like this, at least during the 1850s, and especially the later part of the decade. So I was trying to help sort of reconfigure our common conceptions about American political geography during this period, and to encourage readers to find the slave South in places that they wouldn't necessarily normally associate with the slave South. I mean, at times the line between the slave states and the territorial and far Southwest is blurry, and it's hard to tell where one begins and the other ends.
And thanks for that. And that's one of your kind of key interventions, is bringing both California and those southwestern territories into the story of sectional struggle, the debate over slavery, the ways that party politics maps onto that in ways I think we can come back to. I just want to prompt you to talk about another aspect, which is kind of responding to some of the literature that has really emphasized slave owners in politics and kind of deep South regional interests being primarily focused on the Gulf of Mexico and kind of looking more directly south. And you want to point out their more kind of straight Western vision with an emphasis on the Pacific and Asia. So I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And if you don't mind, I mean, say a little bit about your reading of some of that scholarship that really focuses on the Gulf and directly, to South America, Central and South America, and why you felt like it was important to say something different from that.
This was in a lot of ways the genesis of this project, reading really important, influential work by Bob May. There's the second reference, Matt Karp, Walter Johnson, and thinking about Southern expansion and slaveholding empire. And what I'm really trying not to do is to say that the West is more important than the Caribbean basin or the Atlantic world more generally. I'm just saying that Southerners in the antebellum period could look in both directions at the same time. They could look southeast to the Caribbean, and they could look west across the continent and really across the Pacific. They saw, potentially the tentacles of slaveholding power everywhere across the globe. And actually the Pacific world was really important for them. And it was partly a matter of demographics. China during this period had an astronomical share of the global population. I think the number was something around 30%. So when Southerners thought about the Pacific trade, which was just sort of coming into its own during this period, they saw a vast market, a vast and untapped market for slave-grown cotton. They didn't ultimately, make the serious inroads in Canton that they had hoped, but cotton was the leading U.S. export through most of the antebellum period to China. And they thought this was really just sort of the opening wedge in a much greater commercial influence across the Pacific world. And that's one of the reasons why the construction of a transcontinental railroad along a far southern route was so important to them. They weren't all that clear on the mechanisms of what they often called their commercial empire in the Pacific. They didn't really understand how the China trade worked, but they did understand that they wanted it, and they were willing and very ready to expend sort of enormous amounts of political capital to seize at least a portion of it.
Terrific. Before we go on, I'll remind our audience you can input questions into the Q&A, and which you can see at the bottom, and we'll be starting to pull from those in about 10 minutes or so. We usually do about the first half from what Kate and I have, and then start incorporating questions over the second half. So please don't be shy. But the heartbreaking thing is we sometimes get our best questions at like 59 minutes in with 30 seconds to go or something. So, don't be shy. I wonder if you could play that out, out your point about the centrality of aspirations of the China trade a little bit, Kevin, just because I think when, again, a kind of perhaps a myth that people will have is, well, is the China trade dominated by New England shipping interests? And so what actually would Southern inroads look like? Some kind of alliance with those interests? I mean, those interests are glad to get paid to ship cotton. So, you know, or does it look like something more formidable or something in a different form than just simply sort of making sure that Southern products get into northeastern ships?
I think what you said about the shipping interests of the Northeast being happy to align themselves with the cotton growing South, that was a big part of the calculus there, Greg. But Southerners thought sort of in two very distinct ways about the China trade. One, they fantasized about direct trade. I mean, they were always talking about direct trade, people like Matthew Fontaine Maury. That was, I would argue, more or less a pipe dream when it came to the Pacific during this period. But there was no reason to suspect that, a commercial alliance that worked the same way or much the same way that shipping to Britain and Europe worked could function in the Pacific world. So the beginning of the book, the first chapter, really is an attempt to understand how Northeast commercial interests and Southern slaveholding interests could align when it came to trade to China, but also how the China trade and really how the issue of the Pacific more generally helped trigger a real sectional rupture. And it did so over the Transcontinental Railroad primarily. I mean, this really became a subject of debate. It arose first in 1845 when Asa Whitney proposed the first Transcontinental Railroad in American history, and it really intensified after the US-Mexico War, when it became clear that trade with the West and trade with China to a certain extent was going to be a growing piece of the commercial pie in the US.
Just to give listeners and potential readers a sense of the texture of your book, I wonder if you could, you have some really great kind of stories and some recurring characters. Usually they seem to be people who are, advocates of this Southern / slaveholding vision of the Southwest. So just, tell us about one of your favorite specific incidents or characters that you write about in your book and kind of how they fit into the bigger picture.
Yeah. Thomas Jefferson Green is really one of the characters that first springs to mind. He's this guy with a really incredible transcontinental resume. Originally from North Carolina, I think he served on more state and territorial assemblies than any 19th century figure that I've ever run across. I mean, he was everywhere at once. He was sort of like a Forrest Gump figure, like a devious Forrest Gump figure. So he was in Texas during the Revolution. He was a brigadier general there. He moved to California and the gold rush. He brought over a dozen enslaved African Americans to mine for gold in the gold rush. He became the chairman of the finance committee in the first California legislature. He helped draft a lot of the early legislation. A lot of the early very racist legislation has his fingerprints all over it. And then in the sort of, I think, mid to late 1850s, he returns to the South and very bitterly can't take part in the Civil War himself because he's simply too old. He's also the one who proposed for the first time in California history the formation of a university system. So, Berkeley, in a weird way, that's sort of the origin story of Berkeley and the UC system, is this slaveholding North Carolinian and Texan who makes his way out west.
And just curious, for those of us who are interested in research process and stuff like that, like, how did you find him? Was it that he wrote a memoir? Was it all in one place, this kind of interesting, itinerant, powerful life? Or was it that you were piecing him together because you were finding him in lots of different places? Or how did his story come together?
He just kept popping up. It was like a whack-a-mole. And I think because this book is transcontinental in focus, my research had to be too. So I found letters to and from Green in the Bancroft and at the Huntington, in Chapel Hill, I think maybe in Virginia as well. If I look more closely in Texas, I'm sure he would have been there. So he's just, when you start thinking about the ways that Southerners operated in the far West, he's really, really hard to miss. And I noticed that there were a couple figures like that. And once you begin piecing together their correspondence, because they're writing frequently about the West and about how to extend Southern power over the West, that's how the story really took shape for me.
We're going to come back to some other figures that you highlight, some of whom, as you and Kate have already mentioned, you'll be coming back to in future work. But I wonder, before we do that, if we could set up your argument as well. You've talked about the importance of Southern influence over the West, but you're also making an argument, as are a number of other Western historians, about the importance of slavery itself in the far Southwest, both as a literal state, as a as something that remains, for some people, as something that remains up in the air for others, as a pushing against the idea either of that they're free soil or that their status is definitively settled. And so I wonder if you can help our listeners understand your argument there. How should we understand slavery in the far West in the period you're looking at?
Slavery in this region is a really diverse and sort of capacious category that includes not only enslaved chattel African Americans, but also Native Americans in all sorts of unfree relationships, which often look almost identical to the slavery that you would find in the American South. So the way I thought of this argument historiographically, what do I have to say about the history of slavery in the far West that can sort of move the needle? Because there's so much great work that's been done recently by people like James Brooks and Andres Resendez and Billy Kaiser. To me, the two bodies of literature that I was really trying to engage with were obviously the enormous scholarship on plantation slavery in the South, and then also this really excellent budding scholarship on indigenous servitude in the far West. But often those two bodies of scholarship are, sort of partitioned from one another. We don't usually think of these two forms of slavery as part of the same system. But then when you see how white slaveholding Southerners were writing about indigenous servitude in the far West, it becomes clear that the two were much more closely interrelated than we may have previously thought. So when Republicans in Congress attempted to ban debt peonage, say in New Mexico, which they did on a number of occasions in the 1850s, white Southerners in Congress closed rank because they realized that if debt peonage is outlawed in the Southwest, that could be a lead domino to fall, which would eventually sort of collapse chattel slavery in the South. That once you legislate against unfreedom, their states' rights argument falls to pieces, and the very slave system itself is in peril. And so they were successful. Every time this came up for debate in Congress, they blocked it. And they blocked it because they saw chattel slavery and indigenous servitude as too mutually reinforcing, even if discrete in a lot of ways systems.
I wanted to follow up with a question though about political parties. So what you're describing in the 1850s, you have on the one hand the question of what did these people really believe about slavery and its expansion and its future in the United States, and then you have the question of the problem of being a Democrat, right? Where regardless of what you may or may not, let's say you were Stephen Douglas or somebody like that, like regardless of what you thought about slavery as such, there's a lot of pressure on you to vote with your party. And obviously we can think about analogies to, to this day about the ways that a two-party system kind of funnels people into one position or another, regardless of what they might actually believe in their heart of hearts. So I guess I wonder if you could talk about a bit about how you grapple with the relationship between, these questions of like visions of slavery versus people kind of picking sides in debates that are both they're not about slavery, but they're also about partisanship and exerting power, right? And so how did you parse that? Because I think, some of what you're talking about with respect to California and other places is complicated by divisions within the Democratic Party over what kind of a position to take on slavery.
Yeah, exactly. And I think looking at California in the 1850s might be the best way to parse that. So white Southerners in California at their height were only about a third of the voting population in the state, and yet they won election after election. And they did so partly because California and much of the American West was deeply, much of the United States as a whole was deeply anti-Black. And I would say more deeply anti-Black in California than a lot of places in the country, because the white working class had a particularly prominent position in the state. And so the majority of these white working class voters weren't pro-slavery, but of course we know that you can be both anti-slavery and anti-Black. And so what Southern Democrats in California did very, very effectively was convince voters that voting for a Northern Democrat was tantamount to voting for somebody who was relatively racially egalitarian. Of course, that wasn't true at all. Northern Democrats were not racial egalitarians, but Southern Democrats in California convinced a majority of voters that really the only way to preserve white rule in the state was to side with the political power that was most effective at barring the advancement of African Americans or indigenous people or really any ethnic minority in the state.
Great. So we're starting to get some questions coming in the Q&A, and we'll start pulling from those shortly. So keep them coming in. We've got a couple more topics we want to make sure to get to before we start doing that. And one of the key ones and one of the most interesting pieces of the book is your discussion of the situation for African Americans, especially in California. And you mentioned your future follow-up work on Biddy Mason. And so I wonder if you can help readers for whom this, or viewers for whom this is unfamiliar, understand for not just the relationship to the broader national fight over slavery, but the conditions on the ground for African Americans, especially in California, and how you see that playing out over the time you're looking at. What are they facing, and what does slavery look like when it's there, and what does freedom look like when that becomes possible?
The short answer is slavery looks initially a little bit like the slavery they encountered in the American South, but it wouldn't hold for long. And that's partly because, the majority of enslaved African Americans who were brought west to mine for gold during the late 1849 and into the early 1850s. And on a sort of sparsely policed frontier, it's hard to maintain the same sort of rigorous control over enslaved people that you would have in the plantation South. And so Stacy Smith writes about this really, really well in her book, Freedom's Frontier. You get sort of a renegotiation of the conditions of enslavement, that enslaved people are able to extract a share of the wealth that they're digging up themselves, and they're able to sort of soften some of the terms of their enslavement. But they're never able to eradicate that enslavement, or at least not until really the late 1850s. And they're not able to because the legislature and the judicial powers that be in the state and various officials are committed to preserving at least slavery in some form. And so by 1852, you get this, California passes its own fugitive slave law that enables white Southerners to claim that African Americans are fugitives from slavery, and so long as they eventually return to the South, they're able to remand them to slavery and take them with them as chattel property to the South. And because African Americans were prohibited from testifying in court, either for or against white people, there's nothing they can do really to contest their enslavement. And so in dozens of cases, African Americans who were either previously freed, may have never been enslaved, are considered fugitives and are taken to the slave states.
Great. And do you want to just say a little tiny bit about the subject of your next work, Biddy Mason, and sort of where she fits into that story?
Yeah. Biddy Mason is really the exception that proves the rule. So she was an enslaved person born in Georgia, forcibly transported first to Mississippi, then to Utah by one of these Mormon slaveholders, then to Southern California, to San Bernardino. San Bernardino sort of gets its start as a slaveholding Mormon colony. Biddy and at least 24 other enslaved African Americans, along with an untold number of Native American slaves, worked the fields of San Bernardino. She wins her freedom along with the freedom of 13 others, including her 3 daughters, in 1856 in a Los Angeles courtroom, in a very controversial ruling. And this is 6 years after California technically outlawed slavery. And still, even in 1856, a lot of people looked at her emancipation as illegal, that this was not a legitimate ruling. She then goes on to achieve phenomenal success in Los Angeles. She actually pairs up with a former slaveholding Virginian, who's one of the big doctors in Los Angeles, as the nurse and the midwife in his medical practice. She uses that money that she earns in his practice to begin investing in Los Angeles real estate, right as the population of LA does that. And so does the value of her property. And so by her death in 1891, she's perhaps the wealthiest African-American woman in the American West. And she seeds a family fortune that's estimated at about $300,000 by the early 19th century. Her grandson would use that wealth that she bequeathed to him to become the richest man west of Chicago. But again, sort of the exception that proves the rule in California.
That's an amazing story, and we can't wait to see that play out in book form, and I bet you can't either. Before we jump ahead to your next book, let's stay in the latter part of this book, because our questions have drawn from the first sections, and one of the Q&As that came in asked for the relations, how this story plays out as we get into the war. And of course, that's something that you discuss at some length in the latter roughly third of your book. So you've got this, so how does the story play out once the war begins?
I argue in the book that the political campaign, the slaveholding political campaign to extend control across the continent really has its military analog during the war. Historians have written really, really well about this. Megan Kate Nelson's recent book, I think, does a particularly nice job of helping us understand how the far Southwest, how Arizona and New Mexico, and to a certain extent Southern California was a theater in the war. What I think we've understood less well is why it was considered, a destination for invading Confederate armies in the first place. And so the argument here is it's just sort of a natural outgrowth of a lot of this politicking of the 1850s. So the first Confederate invasion of the war, it's a tiny one, but the first one of the war is actually into New Mexico and Arizona to sort of shore up Confederate control over the territory of Arizona, which held 3 secessionist conventions and seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy as a territory. So the latter part of the book is about this ultimately failed campaign of the Confederacy to build a transcontinental sphere of power. But for a while, it was touch and go, and it led the Union High Command in the far West to really fear for the stability of the entire region.
Great. And then you kind of, by the end, you sort of telegraph forward to how some of these political questions play out in California, particularly in California, giving, I would say, sort of a brief description of the rise of Republican power, and then arguing that the Democrats quickly take back power, or the kind of contested politics of California in the wake of the Civil War. I want to go to a question that came in that is about actually taking us back to before the war and politics, and it has to do with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the kind of the history before that of the Missouri Compromise. And so the question is, and I'm just going to say what the question is. It sounds like the question is that many Southerners claimed in the course of the debates about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that they had always actually supported the Missouri Compromise and the implication that it would have of extending the Missouri Compromise all the way to the Pacific, and therefore that everything north of the 3630 line would have been, free territory, and everything south would have been slave territory. So if you have on the one hand, some Southerners who are saying in prior conditions, they would have been willing to extend the Missouri Compromise line, and now they're not. How do we square your argument about the kind of dominant will to extend and grab as much territory for slavery as possible with a more kind of a history of greater sense of compromise or willingness to divide the country, into half slave and half free?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'd say if you polled the typical slaveholding Southerner across the 1850s and said, okay, you can, let's just extend this line now and make the country fully half slave and half free, would you do it? I think a majority would say yes. Certainly figures like Henry Foote and Jefferson Davis would have taken that compromise. And they would have taken it because that region already looked quite a bit like a pro-slavery region to them. So I think on almost on an annual basis in the 1850s, Southern Californians petitioned to divide the state in two and to break off as a separate territory. And the thinking was, once you break off as a separate territory in Southern California, because white Southerners were actually a majority of the Anglo-American population in Los Angeles County, that territory would become a slave state in due course. People on both sides of the sectional divide recognized that. And that initiative failed partly because Congress was just preoccupied with the secession crisis by the time it actually came to their desks in Washington. But really you see this attempt to divide the entire continent along the Missouri Compromise line right up to the Crittenden Compromise, which again fails. But I think that question is really astute, because slaveholders were willing to compromise. I mean, they would take as much territory as they could possibly get. But if pushed, I think a lot of them would have been satisfied with a clean split across the country.
Terrific. We've got several more questions from the Q&A we're going to be pulling up. I'll turn next to this one from Louisa Brandt, who asks about the Transcontinental Telegraph wire, as you mentioned in the book, and asks whether you see this and other Northern-backed infrastructure projects as explicitly efforts to balance to the overland and other Southern-backed efforts, or if you see them really operating completely separately or differently. Should we see that as a sort of point counterpoint or mate checkmate, or is that really belong in a different narrative?
No, I think it can be brought into this narrative. Probably the most high-profile element of transcontinental communication from this period is the Pony Express, right? But the Pony Express had a really short life, I think somewhere around 19 months. And the Pony Express was more or less a sectional measure. It was designed to attract funding for a more central transcontinental mail route and to deprive the southern route that was successfully funded and constructed in the late 1850s of its federal funding. And so it was basically rendered obsolete by the Transcontinental Telegraph lines. You don't need to use ponies to transmit messages when you can just hit a telegraph. So it is all wrapped up in the sectional crisis in ways that I think aren't immediately apparent.
Great. And I'll just put in a plug for the part of your book that's about camels. If anyone wants to read some interesting and to me somewhat surprising stories, that's a good one. So that's not a direct question. So one other interesting question that's come in, and please, if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them. Do we have figures on the number of African Americans employed in gold and silver mining in the Southwest? How much political discourse in Congress concerned that issue? And had Southern whites anticipated significant employment of Black laborers in Western mines? comparable, let's say, to the use of enslaved people in Virginia coal fields and iron mines? So were they thinking ahead to, attempting to increasingly use enslaved laborers in mining operations in the Southwest?
Yes, the short answer is absolutely. This was part of the calculus of slaveholding expansion or political expansion in the region. Jefferson Davis solicited reports on mining in the Southwest, partly because he believed that it could profitably be mined by enslaved African Americans or enslaved indigenous laborers. So there are a few reasons why there were never, all that many enslaved Black people in the mines in the Southwest. And one of the main reasons is that there were already cheaper forms of unfree labor available. And you have Southerners and Northerners in Congress commenting on this fact. Why bother transporting very expensive chattel property 1,000 miles overland to the mines of the Southwest when you can simply purchase a captive Native American? And that's one of the reasons why African-American chattel slavery doesn't really take root in this region, because there were already so many, in white Southerners' minds, so many better alternatives.
Terrific. So we have a question that's come in on something that Kate and I were inevitably going to bring up anyway, which is the closing section of your book on Reconstruction. So I'll draw from the question that was submitted. It says, in the last chapter of your book, you suggest scholars adopt a transcontinental perspective on Reconstruction. And the question asked, how did you establish the continuous connections between the Deep South and the far Southwest during the post-war period? What do you think helped to create a post-war cohesion of a continental South? And how did the retreat from Reconstruction in the far Southwest anticipate or influence the developments in the Deep South, or the traditionally designated South? So that's several questions. Would it help if I broke them up again, or I was reading from it, or do you feel like you can pull them all together?
I hopefully can pull them all together.
I'm sure you can. I have no doubt.
They're all really good, really important questions. And just briefly, I argue in the book that this transcontinental sphere of Southern influence sort of disintegrates during the Civil War, but it's reconstituted in a modified form after the war. And it's reconstituted partly because a lot of political players in California see themselves in the slave South. They worry that some of the measures imposed by Republicans in Congress in the South could migrate west. And they worry, it takes a different form in the West. They worry primarily over the enfranchisement and the citizenship of Chinese immigrants rather than African Americans, because Chinese immigrants represent about 10% of the state's population in 1870. So the battle over Reconstruction in a place like California takes on a different hue given its multi-ethnic population. But the arguments that Democrats are making at the state level and in Congress sound a lot like the arguments that some white Southerners are making at the time. And so I think it's no coincidence that California was the only free state or former free state to outright reject both the 14th and the 15th Amendment during the Reconstruction era. And they reject them partly out of a fear, probably a misplaced fear, but a fear nonetheless of the empowerment of Chinese immigrants. So obviously the raison d'etre of extending slavery across the West doesn't really hold anymore in the post-war period, but the desire to create sort of common cause amongst white voters along the southern belt of the country, I think still holds and still deeply impacts national politics as well. So ultimately, California, I think to answer the last part of that question, California's refusal to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments ultimately doesn't matter that much because 2/3 of the other states do. But I argue that the backlash in a place like California sort of accelerates and anticipates the retreat from Reconstruction nationally. And a lot of what I'm trying to argue here and how I conceptualize this period and the political geography of the period actually comes from Kate and Greg's excellent edited volume on the subject, The World the Civil War Made. So I hope that, did that get to all the elements of that question, Greg?
I think you did it admirably.
I will ask a follow-up. If I remember correctly, after, I think it was after the Supreme Court decision in the civil rights cases, California was one of the states that passed its own Civil Rights Act forbidding racial discrimination on public accommodations. I'm not sure of the actual year, but a lot of states did it in around 1883. And so I guess my question is kind of, doesn't it kind of depend on which party's in power? And was California sort of Democrat dominated for the pretty consistently? You would know, I do not know. Or, at what points did they switch party majorities in the state legislature and things like that? And how did that shape California's political profile when it came to things like civil rights and race?
Yeah, that's really good, Kate. So California isn't as solidly Democratic in the post-war period as, the white South remains after the war. But when Republicans take power in the early 1870s, they sort of pull a play from the Democratic playbook. And so party divisions matter less. And what I mean by taking from the Democratic playbook is Republicans in California lead the national campaign to impose an exclusion on Chinese immigration. And they argue this. Stacy Smith makes a really great argument, or shows how this is made possible. They argue that Chinese should be excluded from emigrating to the United States because they're coolies, because they're unfree laborers. And so they use the logic of the 13th Amendment to pass a national exclusion law. The end is more or less the same with what Democrats had been arguing for quite a while, even though the means are just like nominally anti-slavery, if that makes sense.
A question that we got submitted ahead of time that you touched on in your first answer, but we'll ask you to expand on a little more here, is about Oregon, which clearly is not the Southwest, but has some interesting interactions in terms of both at the political level, growth of the Democratic Party, the exclusion movements, both of African Americans and of Chinese migrants. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Oregon does and doesn't fit within the broader story you're telling. Everyone understands that not everything can go into one book, especially a first book. But do you see Oregon as part of this broader story, or the Northwest really being part of a distinct story that's taking place?
In the book, Oregon sort of flits in and out of the story. And some people have asked why that map on the cover, and I won't hold it up for a third time, doesn't include the Pacific Northwest, because as I said, there are plenty of pro-slavery legislators, or plenty of strongly anti-Black legislators who would be happy to throw their weight behind some measures coming out of the slave South. And a lot of them were in Oregon, and you really see that in 1860. The reason I didn't include Oregon more prominently in this book is because when Southerners were designing some of their big infrastructure projects that they hoped would help them sort of capture control of the far west, those infrastructure projects went right across the lower half of the country. So it was really more or less a matter of geography that dictated how Southerners themselves operated in this region. And the fact is, there were proportionally more white Southerners in a place like Arizona than there were in a place like Oregon, again, because of geography and the overland trails that led from the south to the far west.
Great. So a couple more questions before we wrap up. And one is about sources. And then the last one is going to be about kind of contemporary connections and relevance. Okay, so sources question from one of our viewers. Where did you find your sources for this book? And what challenges or difficulties did you encounter in finding the material or understanding the subject matter?
I did a lot of my work at the Huntington and the Bancroft, but also across a number of archives in the South, because if you're going to make an argument about sort of a transcontinental network of slaveholders, you have to research transcontinentally, I would argue. So one of the challenges for me was, especially in the early years of the project when it was a dissertation, is is this just the case of a couple Southerners in places like New Mexico and California hoping on their own to capture a share of political power? Or is there something more to this story? Is there actually a network of slaveholders and their allies coordinating an effort to extend political power transcontinentally? And what I argue in the book is, yes, there was a network, and I think I can argue successfully that the network exists because of all the letter writing that slaveholders were doing across the country and trying to figure out how to operate in the West. It doesn't mean that the network was a really fine-tuned conspiracy. The book makes an argument about the slave power, but the slave power wasn't quite as coordinated as some Republicans had feared. But there was, I think, sufficient evidence to argue that the network existed nonetheless.
Great. We have a couple of questions that ask about contemporary relevance, and I'm going to try and group them together so that we can aim to wrap up at an hour and leave people wanting more, which they can find in the book that you've with the beautiful cover you've held up. And so these are questions about the ways that the book can help people understand the power of race and racism in the West, and the ways that that might help both understand and teach the enduring power of racism after the formal end of slavery. And so what can you say, can you help people kind of think about the ways that understanding the deep history of race and racism in the far West can help us today, this I think is specifically from a teacher, think about how racism, lasted, not just lasted, but in many ways grew, expanded in the period after emancipation, and how it can help us break away from thinking of race or racism as something solely a problem, something solely located in the Southeast.
Yeah, that's such an important question. And I approach that question as a former student in California. So I hope the answer is useful to teachers. I mean, as a student growing up in the 1990s in California, I never learned about the history of slavery or pro-slavery politics in my native state. It just wasn't really on the radar, and I had fantastic teachers. It wasn't on the radar because the great work that my book builds on hadn't yet been written. I think it is more on the radar now, though I could be wrong about that. I've had a number of conversations with teachers about this and how this history can be taught. But I think it's important to teach this history because, all too often, I think Californians are guilty of patting themselves on the back and considering that they live in this land of cultural pluralism and progressive policymaking, but really you don't have to scratch far beneath the state's history, to find a much darker past. And actually, the history of progressivism in California is a recently newborn thing. So like you say, Greg, taking a sort of transcontinental lens on the Civil War era helps us understand that slavery and the legacies of slavery and racism, can't be quarantined to the South. It could never be quarantined to the South, of course not. And you actually see that in 20th century California. There were more Confederate monuments and place names in California than any other free state in the country. I've counted more than a dozen of them. A lot of them have been taken down amid the national debate of the last few years, but they sort of just quietly sat there for years and years and years. And I think they sat there because this history had a certain pull in the region, and they sat there too because a lot of Westerners who would otherwise not want to see these monuments in their backyards didn't really know enough about them and about the deeper history behind them.
Absolutely, you've done a lot of great work in helping to bring to light some of the ones that, as you say, some of the trees and so on, where I even talked to somebody at one of the parks who was like, we're trying to find that tree, right? Like, that some of them were very tucked away. Some of them not at all tucked away, as you also illustrated. And does it make sense for you to close out on this with a little bit of the discussion that frames the end of your book about I'm thinking of a specific marker that you played an important role in bringing to public attention with an actual change. I use it in my own. I'm not well, I was technically born in California, but I'm not a Californian, but teach in California. And I imagine that the situation is better than when you were a student. But you still, and there's a lot of variation within the state and what students learn in high school, but it's still quite common for students to come into Reconstruction or Civil War era classes where I do talk about the work you've drawn upon, and really to express bafflement. So it's really important, and to bring forward both the work you're doing, but also that kind of public work. So do you want to wrap up a little bit with some of that public work and why, for example, there's a Jefferson Davis Highway in California? Or
sure, yeah. There's a Jefferson Davis Highway, California, because the United Daughters of the Confederacy thought that this was the best way to sort of extend the lost cause into the West and to make the lost cause transcontinental and to bake it into the nation's infrastructure. And so to me, it seems like a fitting postscript to the story of what I call the Continental South and these efforts to extend a peculiar vision and to extend elements of the South into the far West. And they were obviously very successful during that period, and they remained successful into the 20th century. So you got dozens of Jefferson Davis highway markers scattered all over the West, from Texas into New Mexico and Arizona and California. And another monument I write about in California was an obelisk dedicated to Confederate soldiers who moved to Southern California after the Civil War, really in the late 19th, early 20th century. And this was actually the first Confederate monument erected in the American West. It was erected in the mid-1920s. And that monument just sort of sat there for a while. And I wrote this op-ed in the LA Times saying, hey, this monument's there and it has a strange and fascinating backstory that maybe we should think about more seriously as we teach the history of the state. And within like 4 days, the monument was gone. I didn't say anything about whether it should be removed or not in the article, as I recall, but it was removed because the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville happened like 2 days, I think, after I wrote this op-ed, and then the monuments of California became embroiled in this bigger national debate about the Confederate landscape.
Wow, good for you, and thank you for your work on that. And I think that's just such a great story about the kinds of knowledge and information that historians can bring to the table about things that people don't necessarily know about, not through their own fault, but because it's just not commonly known. So, bringing attention and we all hope that bringing more truth, really historical truth and stories of what really happened. And in this case, how these monuments or names really got there, matters and will be important for the discussions now and in the future. So I want to thank you for that. And thank you for writing this book, which I think people will definitely want to read and engage with, as I think the conversation has shown that it's touching on a lot of different areas and subfields within, broadly thinking about 19th century US history, the West, slavery and capitalism, politics. So it's a really, really helpful book, and congratulations on that.
Thanks, Kate.
We want to thank everyone who came today, and thank you for coming, and thanks if you've come to earlier ones of these. And again, we are the editors of the Journal of the Civil War Era, and you can find our journal on the web. And if you have comments or suggestions for how we might think about some kind of version of this going forward as we hope to emerge from the pandemic, we're happy to entertain suggestions, because we're just trying to think about, the utility of this kind of event, and possible other formats and things like that. So Greg and I welcome your thoughts, and you should be able to find us easily on our website. So thanks so much for coming. Thank you again to Matt Isham and Cecily Zander for all of your support throughout this. And we hope everyone is well and stays healthy, and cheers. We'll see you later.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.